Well, g'day. Welcome back again to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. You'll remember we talked to our team and introduced what this program's all about in our last episode and the conversations we had with our wonderful team at the NSI. This week, we're going to dive straight into the really critical subject matter of information warfare. As we mentioned, one of our objectives is to fight the battle for truth and facts, and so we need to understand what the nature of that threat is first. So this week's program, we'll be talking to Mike Jensen, who's an expert on the subject, and we'll be doing that over the next 2 weeks. So without further ado, let's have that chat with Mike. Welcome back, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here. And look, it's been a dark and dusty history to get to this point, but you've had a lot of time spent on the actual means and methods by which all of this happens and the sorts of approaches that are being taken differently by different sources of threat. Mm-hmm. And so it will be great today to hear from you who our key sources of threats are and how it is they're approaching this subject from a range of perspectives, both the aspects of the professional elements of it, what sort of psychological elements and the other technical means by which they deliver it, and what is the things that they'd like to target within that world. So, Mike, tell us about basically the overview of where we are now.
Well, today we live in a world where it's very difficult sometimes to identify if a message is part of a foreign influence operation or not, because the level of skill in a lot of the adversaries that we face is such that they can very easily put together content that appears like domestically sourced organic communications as a means to deceive the public. Last year, we reached a point at which, for example, there were more online newspapers pretending to be real, authentic newspapers in the United States, but they were partisan controlled, and some of them were laundromats for foreign influence sources. Then there are actual newspapers in the United States. Because of the technological changes, it's much easier for information to reach people who are unsuspecting about its content. I'll give you an example. One of the better documented Russian influence operations called Operation Infection was an account about how the U.S. Army had developed the AIDS virus. It first appeared as a letter to the editor in a newspaper in Mumbai or Bombay called The Patriot. This alleged that a whistleblower saying that these Army scientists had developed AIDS as a way to specifically target the African-American population. That appeared a year later in a Russian newspaper, and then a couple of years later, it started to appear in some of the far-left dissident type of newspapers across Europe. I recall as a high school student in the 1990s, coming across it, somebody had some photocopies of the article on index cards talking about this as something that was legitimate. So it percolated for over a decade.
Right.
But today we live in a world in which this stuff can be generated, some of it using artificial intelligence, and seeded at strategic moments. They can identify points in conversations that are organic and insert divisive content seeking to shift the flow of conversations in real time. And because we have large-scale analytics, all of this can be assessed, and people can develop information-based strategies to best affect specific target populations to change their attitudes and behaviors.
Right. And I know that in your research, you've broken things down into specific subject categories that really explains this most effectively. So perhaps we could have a look at the slide that Michael has prepared for us that sets those subject matter headlines down. And perhaps, Michael, you could take us through this and explain those categories that you've defined.
Sure. Any communication has at least 4 elements associated with it. For communication to occur, you need a messenger. You need to have some sort of content that's communicated. It must be communicated along a channel, and you have an audience. I mean, just shouting into the woods is not communication. And so deception can happen in any one of those parts in the communication process. In terms of the messenger, you can hide who the person who's sending the message really is. And the who is speaking often has a lot of significance for how that message is received.
Right.
I mean, for example, if you're talking about religious subjects, if it's just some random person screaming something on the street, usually that gets ignored. But if it's somebody like the Pope talking about doctrine of his faith, then that has a different weight associated with it. And likewise, it's a common practice for propaganda outlets to try to send their content through other sources that the public's not suspecting of. So that's called the process of information laundering.
Right.
And research shows that when an audience doesn't know what a source is, and they're agnostic about whether or not it's biased in one direction or another, they're more likely to give consideration to the content being communicated to them.
Right.
And we saw this after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Europe blocked access to RT.com, Russia Today. So they, and they're public about this, said, we found other ways to get our content out. And that included, for example, there was a case called the Tenet Media case in the United States. The case was made public in September of 2024, where they had paid influencers on YouTube to put out talking points that were favorable to Russian state interests.
And I've seen reports recently about Russian influence operations now focusing on allegations of Ukrainian war crimes. Have you been monitoring that?
I've seen some of that. Also, we've seen a lot of reporting recently around Putin's claims to Donald Trump that they had encircled a large number of Ukrainian troops, and Trump made a show of how he was pleading for, that they would be, their lives would be spared. And this was all part of negotiations over a prisoner exchange. Just today, there was, of course, a phone call between Putin and Trump about trying to get towards a ceasefire in that conflict. You could see there's that informational aspect that's in the background that forms part of the scene in which these diplomatic events are occurring.
Right. And so that covers the messenger side of the story, setting the foundation for then what develops as the approach taken on the foundation of how they approach dissemination and how they fixate on, I guess, to borrow a word from our title, the fault lines that exist in their target audiences. So how does that then work in terms of the channel through which this is done?
Well, the channel, I think, is really important because the channel is what allows a message to either reach an audience or stops it from reaching an audience, or it favors certain messages reaching audiences. So lots been made, for example, what's happened with X in terms of the promotion of certain kinds of content. And even before Elon Musk took over, there was allegations about certain voices, especially conservative voices, being, quote, shadow banned, where their content was depreciated algorithmically. So algorithms can either promote content and amplify it, or it can create frictions for the dissemination of content. And both of those things can come into play. And then there's outright censorship. I mean, if there could be a filter that says if there's certain keywords that appear in a post, that doesn't get published. And that's widely used in the People's Republic of China, for example, to censor certain kinds of content. We could also censor at the ISP level. The internet service providers could block access to certain kinds of websites to prevent certain content from entering into or being distributed throughout a information environment. And so those channel aspects really are important. They're also important though, in terms of defensive influence or information operations. Because, for example, in 2018, in the lead up to the U.S. midterm elections, there was concern that the Internet Research Agency was going to try to delegitimize the result. And so U.S. Cyber Command, it's widely reported, took the Internet Research Agency offline and took that channel of communication away from them so they couldn't influence the at least the reception of the election and whether or not people thought it was legitimate or not.
Right. So the algorithm's obviously a huge problem because that creates that kind of self-confirming bias dimension too of what we see, where they can tap into a particular interest group and then get circulation through those ready-made, I guess, environments that recirculates the information effectively for them and really achieves that volumizing, right?
Right. And volume can be really important in terms of the audience, because to the extent that there's a higher volume of content, it can help normalize certain views. And research has shown that even if it's something that seemed to be extreme in the first instance, the more you hear it, the more normal it seems. And eventually, certain people are willing to accept things based upon just hearing it so frequently. And there's research in public opinion where the frequency of communication has a significant effect on the opinions people hold. I mean, that's why during political campaign seasons, political parties will put out ads with increasing frequency, especially relative to the periods between elections, because that volume helps stabilize certain political views in the minds of people.
Right. And I guess one of the big dynamics around this is the fact that there's the drift away from looking at legacy media, particularly amongst younger audiences, and really relying more and more on social media platforms for their information. Where are we at with the kind of the breakup of that demographically now in terms of, the rough statistics of what that might look like?
So I think at this point, Gen Y and Gen Z overwhelmingly use online sources as their primary source of information. For Gen Z, I think social media is a majority of the majority of people identify social media as their primary source of political information. And so it just shows that these are really significant sources, particularly for the generations that are going to become more significant later on. Because, I mean, let's face it, the older generations were not getting any younger. And through a process of generational replacement, people tend to not give up the old means by which they consume information. And so you easily imagine they're going to carry this forward in life.
Right. And it's interesting that in Russia, that divide was pretty stark in terms of the older generation seeming to be more supportive of the Putin line of, I guess, theory of why the special military operation was being conducted, etc. Whereas it seemed younger audiences were managing to get alternative sources of information, and so this generational divide was really being amplified in Russia, it appears.
Right. And there was reporting in the early phases of the full-scale invasion that in Russia, there was a spike in downloads of VPNs, virtual private networks, so that people could access information outside of Russia.
Right. Right. And when we take that then to our circumstance, it's kind of flipped a little bit in that you see the efforts to kind of undermine faith in our governments and the generational reverse going on. But in particular, you've got a variety of platforms, of course, and then we talk a lot about TikTok, or TikToxic as I like to call it. And there was one, I think, stark demonstration of the impact it could have during the voice referendum in Australia recently. And whatever your views on that, it was an interesting dynamic to track in that, there was a large scale of support for it initially around, I think, the 64% mark. And I remember listening to an ABC journalist interviewing someone coming out of a polling booth, and they asked the gentleman, how did you vote? And he said, oh, I voted no. And the journalist said, well, do you mind me asking why? And he sort of gave these reasons, X, Y, and Z. And the journalist said, well, none of that's true. It was actually all about A, B, and C. And so the gentleman then said, oh, I should have voted no. And should have voted yes. And so then the journalist says, well, why? Where did you get your information from? And the gentleman said, oh, TikTok. So we also have this issue. We know it's kind of operated by the Chinese, etc. And there are issues around the data that people are sharing on that platform and what purpose might be drawn from that by the Chinese. But what are you seeing in terms of the specific platforms and how that's playing out domestically in Australia?
Well, I mean, part of the difficulty we face is that these are international platforms. And so Australia has less capacity to control what happens
Right.
on them. We have less regulatory capacities. We know that from some of the efforts to try to confront X over content that's on their platform. Similarly, these are issues with TikTok as well. And one of the big problems, of course, is the privacy issues, where any data, if the government of China says we need this access for national security reasons, they can require that any of their companies comply and provide whatever data is necessary. There was a reported case in the United States where they did this with respect to a journalist there, who had been somebody reporting a lot of negative stories about the People's Republic of China. Now, that's one set of problems, but the other set of problems relate to the circulation of information. And TikTok is particularly a vulnerable source of information because videos captivate people's attention. And the way we consume video information is a little bit different than when we consume something that's written as text because it engages the brain differently. We're less likely to critically engage with the informational content that we're consuming.
Right.
And it's short. And the fact of the matter is people don't have long attention spans.
Right.
There have been studies on TV news reporting over the last 40, 50 years, and you can see a decline in the average soundbite. Particularly, it's pronounced in the United States where the average soundbite is about 7 seconds long.
Right.
So you better get your message into that. And that doesn't lead to a lot of depth of context, background, or underlying understandings of issues.
Right.
And so that's a ripe space in which a propagandist can enter because they don't want you engaging any of that and thinking critically about the subject.
Right. So, we've been educating generations now to have those short attention spans. And so TikTok, I guess, perfectly plays into that. I don't know what it is, like 90 seconds or something that's the maximum you can have, or a minute or whatever. And so whatever image you see is completely lacking in context and can be easily exploited, I guess. And of course, I think we've been seeing a lot of images that have been transferred across sort of issues as well, being falsely represented as relating to something, whereas actually they're a historic thing or they came from some other circumstance. So there seems a wide field of opportunity there in those social media platforms to do this sort of thing.
Right. I recall seeing in 2020 a short video clip allegedly portraying ballot stuffing in Georgia.
Right.
And if you look very carefully, there was the Russian Federation symbol on the side of the boxes. And it was a recycled video from that context.
So maybe it was Georgia in the former USSR rather than Georgia
Could have been,
in the
yeah.
United States. Yeah. So that's very interesting, mate, on the channel side of things. And in terms of the content, what's sort of the array, the issues related to the content that they're portraying? Is there a theme, a strategy behind that, or what's the nature of it?
So we often talk about this problem in terms of misinformation or disinformation, and the two are differentiated by whether or not there's an intentional deceiver involved, that's disinformation, or if there is somebody who authentically believes in the substance of a message, even though it's factually incorrect, and that would be misinformation. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of other ways in which message content can deceive an audience. And a lot of it has to do with the way we parse information. Any falsehood, as Ladislav Bittman, who was a Czechoslovakian defector to the United States during the Cold War, explained, that's just a means to produce an influence end. And if one falsehood fails, you just shift to another, or you shift to another technique for trying to influence your audience to take on a particular belief. But beyond that, there's different ways you can parse issues.
Right.
And so, I mean, the world is very complicated and complex. There are vastly different representations that appeal to individual facts that, for example, describe the situation in Gaza either portraying Israel as the victim or portraying Gaza as the victim and Hamas as the defender of Gazans.
Right.
And those both appeal to facts, but the devil is in how do you assemble those facts?
Right.
And how do you represent situations by selecting certain facts? Because any representation of a situation involves selecting certain elements that you're going to represent. And if you're going to select something, you have to have criteria to select something.
Right.
If you have criteria, then you're putting certain values on a set of one element of the facts, and you're undermining the value of other aspects of that situation. So that's always going to be a value-laden statement, a rendering of the nature of a situation. And those are things that we don't talk about normally. And the fact that we don't talk about them allows a lot of malign influence to happen under the guise of presenting something that appears informational.
Right. It seems that part of this dynamic in terms of the legacy media plays into each other here in terms of that attention deficit sort of issue. And I guess legacy media or some outlets trying to portray things in black hat, white hat sort of context. So who are the good guys, who are the bad guys? And part of that is what's the emotional engagement you're looking to create with the audience. It's kind of morphing over into infotainment rather than actually information transmission. And it seems there's also been this migration of what used to be the preserve of editorial programming into news programming, and this tendency for journalists to interview journalists about subject matter. I mean, is that something that is being intentionally exploited as well, or is this just a sort of a natural tendency in media outlets here to try and paint things in black and white terms and eliminate the complexity that exists in somewhere like the Middle East, for example?
I think it's something that's happening broadly beyond just Australia, because of the nature of news is having to generate viewers. There's an effort to, on the one hand, try to reduce complexity. And so one of the ways you do that is to create simple narratives for people to understand in this context or that context. These are the good guys, these are the bad guys. And that simplification is a move that's made through the construction of these narratives. A lot of words convey tones without conveying information about a situation. They tell you how you should think about something as opposed to what is that thing that you're thinking about.
Right.
And those kinds of simplifications are also happening. And again, it gets back to this whole decline of the attention span of the average viewer, and the need for news to generate, even in legacy media, to generate, viewers and therefore revenues.
Right.
I mean, I remember growing up in Los Angeles, every day the weather was relatively nice. We were pretty spoiled. So what did one of the local networks do? They hired a comedian who would tell jokes while doing the weather report.
Right.
And what do? They put the weather report at the end because that's the one thing that you people need to know. Do I need an umbrella tomorrow?
Right.
Or something like. There's always that possibility.
Drag them through the program.
Yeah. So you keep them paying attention. They also throw sports in there too, because that's one of the other things that attracts people.
Right.
All the complexities about what's going on in this conflict area, or the nitty-gritty about some policy decision, that's the boring stuff. That's not the stuff that excites people.
Right.
And so those are all strategic calculations in terms of how media is produced.
Right.
And legacy news media, whether it's satellite or paid TV offerings of news programs or broadcast news programs, they likewise have to pay attention to their viewership figures.
Right. And in our last program where we talked about the historical background, we talked a lot about how we have this alignment now between particularly Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea, and how their legacy media and galaxy of outlets is being used to kind of amplify also their social media campaigns, but they've found a sort of a ready-made vulnerability in the developing world, particularly because they offer polished and produced product at a very cheap price, which undercuts Western media outlets. So you've got Press TV, Hispan TV from Iran. You've got Xinhua and its Galaxy of stuff from China. And Russia has its RT and Telegram and Doppelganger and all these things. And interestingly, then you open up this discussion about what is then journalism in the people who either work for those outlets or engage with them and maybe facilitate or enable them. So one of the examples that I think challenges people is the story of Julian Assange. Is he a journalist or isn't he? Is he presenting information or isn't he? Is he part of the information warfare effectively? And I think one of the things that sort of introduces that challenge is how he was used in relation to that US election campaign of 2016 that you referred to. And, the fact that sitting in the Ecuadorian embassy, he was really only being interviewed by RT most of the time. And when they hacked and sourced that Democrat email traffic and it was aired by Julian Assange, they fed it through to him, he never once sort of entered into any kind of attempt to release information or talk about the Republican side of that story. It seemed he had very definitely chosen a side. He had particular views about Hillary Clinton and I guess was wanting to break the machine with backing Donald Trump. But you saw through those interviews too with RT and other right-wing media outlets that he was also, I guess, fueling some of these really dark rabbit hole conspiracy theories like the death of the Democrat staffer and the sort of weird theories that developed around that. So, did you actually see an intent there in Assange or a willingness, or was he just being used as a front for the Russians in that instance?
I think there's definitely an intent and willingness.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't blind to what he was doing. He'd spoken specifically about his dislike for Hillary Clinton. And what he saw as hypocrisy in the Western world, especially in the United States, he really wanted to go at them. So there was a political agenda in that regard. There have also been reports that WikiLeaks was offered, hacked material from Russia, which they decided was not of interest,
right? And
they didn't want to post that. And likewise, as you note, there's nothing that appeared on the Republican side, despite some reporting that Republican email accounts had also been compromised,
right?
And potentially there was some dirt there. I'm sure within the RNC there have been emails back and forth that raised some consternation about what's going on with this Donald Trump campaign. I mean, many of the candidates were vocal about it, some of whom are now either vocal supporters within the Republican Party of Donald Trump or even part of his administration. I mean, Marco Rubio was very critical of Donald Trump in 2016 and flash forward to 2025 and he's Secretary of State in the second go at a Trump administration. So I'm sure there would have been some really interesting emails there too, of the same order that they made light of with respect to Bernie Sanders and his relationship with the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders not even being a member of the party,
right,
and seeking its nomination. Right. That supposedly was a scandal. I'm sure there would have been scandals as well amongst members of the Republicans in that regard. And those emails could have been easily equally as newsworthy as the ones that they deemed were newsworthy about the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think it's curious to me that within the United States there hasn't been a lot more joining of these dots. Like, for example, when Donald Trump gets up in the 2016 campaign and says, Russia, if you're listening, get those leaked emails out, get those emails out there. It was kind of a very blatant giveaway as to the mutual interests that were at work there. And of course the extensive effort during that campaign. And now, of course, it seemed that then, activities of Trump in, I guess, undermining NATO in many ways, are now carrying forward into the way he's behaving with Vladimir Zelensky and the Ukraine and flipping the narrative about who started the war and all the rest of it. It just does seem that there is this kind of alignment of interest and narrative there. And, is that being really, I mean, how seriously is this being examined in the United States by the media?
I don't think it's being examined that closely or with much nuance. I mean, there certainly is by some of the more left-leaning ideological media, suggestions that, he's some sort of an agent of Russia. There was recent reporting that he was recruited in the 1980s, that he had the codename Agent Krasanov or some such thing. Turns out there was a Krasanov who was was killed by Stalin, executed for collaboration with the Nazis.
Right.
So I don't know if that was, if that really was your code name, I'm not sure how comfortable you'd be in that kind of a position.
Right.
But I think, some of this misses the point because there's kind of a fixation on, can we find, evidence that Trump is a controlled agent of Russia? And if you look to what people who've worked in the intelligence business, obviously retired people, they will point out that Russia doesn't necessarily look to recruit somebody they control. Rather, they look to recruit and use various indirect means to support persons that they see as advantageous to their interests.
Right.
So they talk about in espionage circles the means of inducing an agent, or how you recruit an agent, and those include motivations, and it could very well be this is just part of Donald Trump's worldview that is ideologically congruent with the interests of Russia and seeing a reduced or an irrelevant NATO, smaller footprint of influence for the United States, who doesn't believe in using soft power, such as we've seen, the efforts to eliminate USAID, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, etc. Those could just be ideologically congruent positions between the two.
Just aligned.
Yeah, or it could be that there's some sort of ideological position associated with that, liking the ideological position of a personalist strongman. And there's been a lot of work that's been done by political scientists actually on that identifies certain aspects of the way Putin rules Russia, similar aspects the way Xi rules China, to the aspirations that Donald Trump has. I wish America and Americans would respond the way Russians respond to Putin or the Chinese respond to Xi. Those are things that have been noted, but it could also be that there's some sort of compromise that they have on them. I kind of doubt that because there have been so many things that have come out already that one additional thing probably doesn't matter.
Right.
Or there could be some sort of monetary inducements that are leading him to do that. And sure, there's been some reporting that the Russian mafia channeled money to the Trump organization, particularly at times when they needed that. That could be, maybe. I don't know what sustains him going forward. He's got billions of dollars. Former presidents usually can set themselves up pretty good. Right. I'm not sure what the big inducement is, but to a certain extent, I guess it's irrelevant at this point. It's more of, look at the policies. Do they achieve results? Does the, coercion against, Ukraine and other allies achieve results relative to the, kind of soft touch to Russia?
Right.
Is it they just don't have any leverage points, or they don't have a created enough diplomatic team that finds the leverage points that can put pressure on Russia to do some real compromises and work towards peace, as opposed to saying, well, we'll stop certain kinds of attacks, but we're not going to relent from any of our imperialist war aims.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. Fascinating to hear from Mike and what a wonderful expert he is and a resource to have for us. Next week, we'll carry on this theme and talk about some of the other issues associated with information warfare, including how we deal with the challenge and threat. So we'll see you then. Cheers.